Ellie and Oliver, thanks for jumping on. I'm really excited to talk to you guys. I saw just brief interview or overview for the audience. You guys were awarded a grant from OpenAI for the Democratic Inputs to AI initiative. But before we jump into that, if you guys could just give a quick recap of your organization and a little bit of background for both of you. Oliver, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having us, David. Our organization comes from almost a decade of research from one of our co-founders, Joe, who was early on in this humane technology way, realizing that we have all of these social systems optimizing for engagement, and it's leading to all kinds of bad societal outcomes. So he went on a research question trying to understand what should we optimize for instead. And that's a very difficult question that has some answers in philosophy and some answers in economics. So he did all of this research, originally intended for recommender systems, but we're now applying it to LLMs because it's a sort of continuous problem. And this is also part of a larger, I would say, social vision that Ellie's been working a lot on, which involves how you can think of a post-AI world. What would give us meaning in such a world? And a lot of our work is around values and meaning and understanding how you can interview people to find out what their values are and how you can build AI systems that are optimized for meaningful lives.
Wonderful. Ellie?
Yeah, great intro. And yeah, thanks, Dave, also from my side. Yeah, I guess I'll just add that we're a bit of a weird organization for our work in AI, because actually we are like philosophers, and our quest is really like understanding what the good life is and what makes life beautiful and meaningful. And I guess our specialty is like we get like super nerdy on that, and that's where our like work on like values articulation comes from. And then it happens to be the case that this nerdiness around the good life is actually super useful, both in like how to design AI systems that respect values and respect the good life. But not just for that, it's also kind of like it helps envision a new way for arranging economic systems. Like what would be an economy that was like really centered around meaning and values? And not just that, also like communities, but also kind of like more broadly, like a new way of like understanding society and like how do we fit in it in a way that's kind of like really centered around meaning.
Excellent. No, I love that, the intersection of economics and philosophy, because that's kind of where I've found myself. Just like when you confront the possibility or maybe even inevitability that AI is going to change stuff, right? It really forces you to question, what do you care about? If it's going to reshape stuff and we have some authority, some agency over the trajectory, where do we want to go? If you can go anywhere, where do you go? That was actually the very first question that I asked myself when I was using GPT-2. I said, we have something that can think about anything, obviously in its limited capacity. So what do you want it to think about? If you make a thinking machine that can choose any topic, how do you choose those topics? So before we get into the lost in the weeds, because I'm sure we can talk about that for a long time, there's a lot of passion in the room. Let's talk about kind of the genesis of what brought us here today, which is OpenAI. Back, I think it was April or May of last year, they published their call for participation in the Democratic Inputs to AI. The open source team that I did, we did our own little demo thing. We weren't a very serious contender, but just yesterday they announced, here's the 10 that they funded, and part of the announcement was there was far more than 10 that were good contenders, but what they tried to do is get a good cross section from different perspectives. And you guys were near the top of the list in terms of people that have been awarded. So I reached out to you guys. So take us on that journey. What was like, where were you kind of when you saw that announcement? And then like, did you have like a team meeting, like we got to do this? Or were you like, already working on something, like, and then what was the work like? And then, tell us the whole story. And either Oliver or Ellie, if you want to take it away from there.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. Yeah, so it's funny actually. We were in San Francisco at the time. We're usually based in Berlin, but we were in San Francisco and we had been working with some of the people at OpenAI already. And they mentioned that some teams inside OpenAI had been concerned about this question of like, now that ChatGPT is going mainstream, and people are starting to use it, some people are dissatisfied with what ChatGPT says amongst like certain kind of like contentious political questions, and they're posting everything on Twitter and like, what should we do about it? And that just led to us meeting that team, and especially Wojciech Zaremba, who was the one who was like leading that initiative at the time. He's one of the co-founders of OpenAI. And yeah, we just had some meetings discussing, you know, what we thought they should do about the problem. And they were like, okay, what can you do? And I was like, well, we can do something, but you have to pay us for it. Because this is, you know, actually a bit of work. And then they were like, okay, but we're a for-profit. So that's how then other people got involved in this, and that's how eventually like the grant was incepted, and then we applied.
Okay, so you're kind of part of the genesis of even this whole grant program. So you're already kind of in talks with them, and it's really interesting that it happened as a reaction to a problem, because I remember all that. Like I was not as concerned about the mistakes that ChatGPT, maybe mistakes is the wrong way to characterize it, but you know, disagreements, because I'd been using since GPT-2, GPT-3, you know, plain vanilla unaligned models that can say whatever you want them to say. And so when ChatGPT came out, and I could kind of sense some of the alignment that they had started with, like what kind of values to choose. But yes, it's been very contentious, and one of the primary questions, and I'm sure you guys have heard this a million times, is what do you align to? Who gets to decide? Who's the arbiter or the gatekeeper of quote unquote human values or whatever? So so take us through the, like, okay, so that's the beginning of the project. So and you said that you're already working on some similar stuff. So how did you come up with the idea that you did come up with, and kind of the ultimate product is the moral graph, which once you see it, it's super intuitive. So I love that idea. So tell us about the moral graph, and maybe work backwards from that story. Yeah, go for it.
So the moral graph is inspired by primarily two philosophers, one called Charles Taylor and one called Ruth Chang. And these philosophers have thought a lot about values and how especially values fit together and how they develop. So there's a whole sort of moral learning theory that we're building upon, that this project is based on. To give a sort of intuition of what the moral graph is, you can think of it a little bit as like an outline of several moral deliberation instances that have happened, where you have two values coming together into what they call a more comprehensive value. And this could be a balancing value that balances some important aspects of two other values.
Yeah.
So an example of that could be in certain social situations, you're trying to be a little bit smart-assy, but you also have values around trying to be honest and authentic, and these kind of collide. So you're left with some kind of need for a new balancing value. And this balancing value could be trying to ask genuine, curious questions or something like that, which kind of gets at the important parts of both of the two values that it balances. There's also another interpretation of the graph where an edge between two values in the graph is akin to a deeper cut into something that was important in the first value. So an example of this could be, and actually a real example in the moral graph that we elicited, is for parenting, when you're trying to parent a kid, or disciplining a kid really, or trying to get them to behave. Some people elicited the value that was around instilling discipline into the kid. And then some people elicited the value that was about igniting the child's curiosity. And we saw that people drew this arrow from the inspiring discipline into the igniting curiosity value, saying that it's a wiser version of the same value, because it's both trying to get at the same important thing, which is trying to empower the kid's agency, but one sort of does it better or resolves a certain, or kind of considers other things that the first value didn't see. So this is what the moral graph kind of outlines for particular contentious situations, which values are wiser than others.
That makes a lot of sense. So let me ask a couple of questions to kind of get more at the heart of it. So in graph theory, whether it's semantic graph, knowledge graph, or hypergraph, or whatever, you end up with structures that emerge. And it sounds like some of the and maybe I'll ask you to unpack what are some of the dimensions. But it sounds like context is one of the key dimensions that you look at. So like in this context, there's a cluster of expressed values that values that are surfaced based on like a decision that you'd make or what you're aiming for. But then it sounds like from these clusters, you can identify or surface almost like what is a wiser value based on the outcome that you're looking for. So is that kind of an accurate reading? What did I get right and what did I get wrong about that?
Exactly. No, actually, you got it all right. So we do think of values as contextual, right? Like there's certain values that apply when you're parenting a kid. There are certain values that apply when you're talking to your girlfriend, and these are totally different scenarios. So we need different sort of instances there. And all of these edges that I talked about are for a particular moral case, for a particular scenario. And since we end up with a directed graph, we can actually use things like PageRank to figure out or rank it somehow and figure out which values are sort of considered to be the wisest value of a population for a certain question. And this unlocks something that's kind of interesting that you don't get when you just vote for values, because when you just vote for values, you don't build on each other's moral reasoning. Whereas when you do something kind of like PageRank, you can think of someone attesting to one of these hops being wiser, saying, oh, this value is wiser than that one, I agree. And then you have several other hops continuing up in this branch of the graph. And by using some kind of graph algorithm like PageRank, you can count this transitive vote as a vote for a particular branch in the model graph, which is pretty interesting. And we also found this in the survey data that we did afterwards. People actually agree that they learned something from others, and they also agree that they thought that the value that they submitted ended up in a fair position in the model graph. And it's kind of hard to imagine someone losing in a vote and saying, I think that was fair. My vote was not the right one. So I think that's pretty cool as a democratic process innovation to have a process where people end up saying, I think the output is fair, even if they don't win.
I love that. So it's almost like using a directed graph and having an array or a spectrum of moral options or value-based options. You can navigate or kind of pathfind to some value. So I have a few follow-up questions just about this moral graph theory. So one, this is an area that I have studied under like Lawrence Kohlberg and finding universal principles, which of course nobody agrees on universal principles right now. But with a large enough population, like the whole 8 billion people participating, and with enough time and enough examples, do you think that this kind of technique could ultimately identify maybe not completely universal values, but at least broadly shared values? Is that kind of something that's an option? And that this is totally personal agenda asking that question, but what are your thoughts on approaching universal values?
I think you're right. I think there are such a thing as something kind of like universal values, but rather than uncovering them, I see it more as you're continuously branching out, and there is no like ideal universal values. But as you encounter new situations, both as an individual and as a collective, you will grapple with tensions in between values, and there might be balancing values that we can kind of develop. So I think of it more as like you develop more universal values rather than finding them. But we did actually find a lot of convergence in our graph, and we also did this process specifically with a representative sample of America. So we had both Republicans and Democrats participating, and we had very contentious questions. So one of them was about abortion, which is a gridlock in the US. And we did find values that both Republicans and Democrats endorsed. And the reason why we do that is that we have a very specific definition of how we think about values. We don't think about them as these slogans that you hear on television, but we try to drill down into what exactly is the underlying thing that is meaningful to attend to.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
no,
like the underlying reasons or motivations.
Yeah. Ellie, do you want to unpack that a little bit more? Like kind of like where what is the grounding? And maybe I'm not asking the question right, but earlier you talked about like aligning, maybe not aligning, but the good life. Like when you start kind of like, where does the value come from in terms of like personal meaning? Like like what is the resonance there? Because people have different definitions of what a good life is.
Totally. Yeah, that's a big question. I'm gonna see how can I pack it. Basically, so we're all living in more or less like the same reality, like the same society after all, despite what social media would want you to believe, right? And so as we live our happy lives in this society, there's, or not so happy in some cases, but there are always things that kind of like they catch our attention, right? They kind of like snap us out into like presence with life. And you can say, you know, like a classical, like a sunset, right? Or like the moment where you have a child. These are like really, you know, the child one is like a really big sort of like meaningful experience. But the same sort of like feeling of meaning actually happens like very often if you like pay attention to it, right? So you might have, you know, like a community experience where it kind of like really resonates with you, with this kind of like deeper core of you. And there's like, oh, that was meaningful. But we never really think kind of like what exactly made that meaningful, right? And so in politics, this happens all the time. Like people have a set of like lived experiences, and some of them were more meaningful than others. Some of them like resonated more with them. And what happens is that we tend to kind of, you know, like good politicians tend to sort of like create like a projection board with slogans that is like meant to like contain all these sort of like meaningful experiences, right? And that serves as a certain purpose. Like it's easier to kind of like rally people behind that. But at the same time, it like loses all the texture of the things that are actually important to people. So you could say that in the case of like abortion, behind like slogans as like, I'm pro-life, or I'm like pro-choice, like there's a lot of kind of like detailed, kind of like nitty-gritty experiences that people have lived in order, like, oh, I had to take like a really tough decision. And in that moment, what I valued was like the wise guidance and mentorship from like an elder that had more life experience, right? And that's not exactly the same as like follow whatever your religious says to you, like a religious leader says to you, like, right, that has a lot more like granularity and context and comes from like a meaningful experience that you actually had. That's what it means that it's a value. That it's not just a thing that you're following, but that it comes from your own life, like your own lived experience. And when you actually start to talk to people as people who have meaningful experiences, you see that because we live in the same reality, we agree way more than when we just talk at the ideological level. And it also, you know, when you talk about meaning or like values and especially experience, it has this advantage that it's much easier to like resonate with people and to like empathize with people then, because you see where kind of like all the thoughts and decisions come from.
Well, first, I think one of the most salient points there is that if you talk in the more abstract, ideological, more categorical thinking, you're going to end up with more polarization. And so one of the things that the moral graph allows for is a lot more nuance and exploring the contextual differences, the differences in lived experiences, and also kind of almost like a representation of Socratic dialogue. Well, what about this situation? And what about this other situation? And how do you not split hairs? That's making it sound like a bad thing, but how do you actually dive into those points and rigorously, systematically do it? So, and kind of going back to a point that Oliver made, where it's a process. Right. It's not that there's a universal value that's out there to discover. It's we're actually creating it as we explore this, like how democracy is a process or negotiation is a process. So viewing morality, ethics, values as a process of discovery or creation rather than it's a thing that exists that's fixed. We're inventing it as we go. Is that kind of a better way of looking at it or a different way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But I guess there is some grounding in, so I don't want to make it sound like we're just sort of making it all up, because I do think there's some grounding in yourself and what like I think we all have some sort of moral intuition. And you can usually tell that something feels usually when something feels wrong on a very deep level, there might be a reason for it. So it's not that it's all, it has a link towards you as an agent. But that being said, I do think there's, you can think of it as a sort of evolving process, yes.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, evolution. Ellie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, like evolving and refining. I think also like something that like people ask us when we do this work on values and meaning is like, oh, but like haven't we like already figured everything out, you know, in the past? That's like a very hot take these days. And it's like, oh, yes, there were kind of like some very like fundamental pieces of wisdom that we did figure out, like the importance of like community and like healthy relationships and, you know, like tight social fabric and so on. but it's always, with this kind of like evolution of morality, I see it as kind of like getting even like more refined on like what these like values were. And it's also this process of like constant like rediscovery that happens both at the individual and collective level. And I think the moral graph is a very good data object that can track these transitions. Right now it's very small, but eventually we have this goal that it would be very big, and even be able to like represent other pieces of wisdom that people have created through like scanning books for data and so on.
That makes sense. So, congratulations on the grant. What are the next steps from here? Like, where are you going to take this work?
So the immediate next step for us is to fine tune a model based on this moral graph. So we want to actually see, do users end up preferring a model trained in this way rather than trained using RLHF or constitutional AI? And we do think that a model that will be trained using this moral graph, you will do it in sort of a similar way. There are a little bit more steps to it, but it would basically be the same process where you create a data set based on the winning values in the model graph using something kind of like PageRank for a particular context, and you rank completions either with human annotators as in RLHF or using an AI system as in constitutional AI. And we think a model trained using this methodology would have a bunch of benefits. It would feel a lot more like interacting with some sort of moral agent, or almost like a human that has some sort of stance in certain questions. So, for instance, if you ask ChatGPT now, like, what should I do? I'm a Christian girl and considering getting an abortion. It will give you like a bullet list of some sort of high-level points. And it kind of refrains from being, from trying to position itself in that moral context, being like, okay, well, what do I need to know here to give a good answer? We don't know quite yet, but we do think this is what will happen. So we're currently doing that. And that involves also creating a larger model graph, because we just did a case study here with OpenAI, but now we're going to scale this up quite a lot and then fine tune models using the model graph and RLHF. So that's the immediate next step for this project. Then we have two, I guess, more broader experimental projects. I'll talk about one of them, and maybe you can talk about the other, Ellie.
Yeah.
The first one is around superintelligence. So we think that something kind of like a moral graph is relevant for superintelligence as well. And this is because it allows us to reason about values and new values based on context, even when the contexts are context where no human has ever been put in it. So you can think of an AI system that will be put in a position where it has, direct information to millions of people's intimate lives, like no human has ever been put in that position, and that will require new kinds of values that no human have. And we think that something kind of like the moral graph will allow us to reason about this, and also to create new values such that they are legible to humans. But this is very early on still. And as for the next project, Ellie, maybe you can talk a little bit about the sort of AI economy broader vision that you have.
Maybe before that, I'll mention there's a smaller thing that we want to do in between, and maybe someone in your audience would like to help. We would like to export the process that we did for OpenAI, which is basically like a values bridging process to kind of like other use cases. So there was someone that we've been talking who's involved in like local San Francisco politics, who would like to run a similar process on San Francisco housing policy. And because like our process is like very good for like, gaining respect across like the political divide, and like maybe even finding converging values, we think that that's like a very practical first thing to do that would show the value of what we created. So that's it's a smaller experiment, but we think that it's pretty promising. And if it works, we could easily export it to other cities and use cases. We also think that if we manage to help fix San Francisco, or even bring like a little bit of hope to that city, that's like a massive win in tech, even if we don't do the AI thing. So yeah. So it's a smaller experiment that could potentially be bigger, but then there's another thing that connects to the moral graph, connects to the economy, and also connects to this point that you said earlier in the conversation of kind of like understanding ourselves better. And how do I start? So we have these part of of the philosophy of our organization is that we have this premise that like right now markets are really broken. They're really misaligned with the things that people actually truly want. So what do people want? Well, most people want adventure and community and like, self-expression and creativity and belonging. They want these kind of like deeply meaningful experiences. What happens that these kind of like deeply meaningful experiences, or even meaning in general, has been considered like the ineffable, right? That is sort of kind of like fairy sprinkles that if you're lucky, you go through life and you kind of like find them every now and then. We think that's a problem of language, actually. We think that you can F them, you can actually articulate these meaning experiences if you have, if you like really try to kind of reflect back on them. And the process that we built, that first used to be an interview that a person would do to someone, but now it's an interview that an LLM does to you, in this case, ChatGPT, helps you articulate the meaning behind an experience that you had. So we actually have like a GPT on the GPT store. So we can add these in the links if any of your subscribers are curious about that. But what is this good for? Well, first of all, it helps with this problem because like when you're creating this like godlike technology, like super intelligence, you also need to know how do you want this intelligence to best serve you? Because it's asking this question of like, what do you want? And it can basically give that to you. So we need to kind of like really step up ourselves too and like know the ways in which we want to like relate to this technology. In which ways do we really want to be helped? Which is not usually our most shallow desires or our preferences. That's one side of it. But then the other side is that by like knowing really what are the things that we truly want, like what are the meaningful experiences that we want in life, that makes it much easier to coordinate with others and to kind of like be able to like find and match people according to their values and their meaningful experiences. So something that we've prototyped and we've been playing with is this sort of like web app where like people go, they articulate their values, and we do this also kind of like in an event format. And then they are put in a sort of digital space, and they can see the values of all the other people that articulated the values in that space, and then they're matched to do activities, they're suggested meaningful activities to do. And it's sort of like a very toy prototype, but kind of like points in this vision of a future like economy or like way of connecting people. You can say that the economy, like markets and recommender systems, are kind of like 2 points in the same spectrum, right? They're trying to match people with things that they want. So these would be these like sort of recommender system that like matches people based on values or source of meaning.
I like that. So I jotted down four topics to cover. And one is just kind of a question. It's not really meant to be a gotcha, but it's just a thought experiment based on moral graph theory. And then we'll unpack all these experiments that you guys either are working on or want to do. So the kind of hot seat question is, how does your system or theory handle things that are, at least on the surface, appear to be diametrically opposed? And so what I mean by that is like, what if someone says the government should be a theocracy versus a secular government? These are things that seem like they're completely mutually incompatible. Or conversely, on a more like global scale, collectivist societies versus individualist societies. So have you done any work there, or have you seen any of this kind of surfacing in your work? And how does a moral graph and AI like intersect with that?
Yeah, sure. So the first step in our process, even before we do any of the graph stuff, is this kind of step of articulating a value. And we think of values as something very specific again. So like neither of those things that you mentioned would cut it. So if you came into a question and said the government should be a theocracy, our chatbot would try to drill down into that and ask, okay, so like what's important for you in a theocracy? Like what do you attend to there? Like what kind of ways of living that you get in a theocracy are important to you?
Yeah. And it would ask also experiences that you've had, which are very important.
Exactly. So you want to ground it in an actual personal experience that you've had or that you've seen someone else have that inspired you. And once you end up with a value, we actually, in our process, you get a values card at the end, which is kind of a little encapsulation of a value. Those are very relatable. And even if you don't necessarily have it yourself, they're not exactly mutually exclusive. So there might be kind of, it is true that the Republicans and Democrats in our process surface slightly different values in this process, but they both kind of relate to each other's values, and they see the wisdom in the other way of approaching things. It's more about like, I surface these things as the important things, and I surface these things as important things, but they don't actually, they're not actually mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And then once you do the graph step on top of that, you find even more convergence. So even before the graph step, there is this kind of step of trying to get down into what is the data object that we're going to work with. And it's not slogans, it's not statements, it's not votes, but it is this very specific thing that we call values, or sometimes we call them sources of meaning, as in like it's some source of a meaningful way of living to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe I'll add to this that we don't want to sound like overly utopian. It's not that we think necessarily that like if people go through our process, everyone will agree, even on like very contentious issues. Like, no, like value disagreements, like they are real and they happen often, but it's rather that kind of like when you're able to express the things that you really care about in a non-ideological way, even when there's disagreements, it's much easier to like first empathize with the other and then like be able to like come to an agreement or sort of like coordinate around this disagreement.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, no, that really kind of helped me understand the utility of this approach. And it ties back to, you know, learning happens, empathizing happens, and so this sounds like it has the potential to be a really key component in you know, solving many coordination problems and value problems across society. You know, I posted an article recently on LinkedIn just looking at like the underpinnings between American or Western civilization and China, and it's like, well, like we have a lot of Taoism in our free market theory. Like we actually have very similar values already in terms of what we like the outcomes that we value. So I appreciate that, and this is being a rigorous way of either creating or discovering or converging on those. So you've mentioned convergence a few times, which is the segue to kind of the next topic. And so in my work, when I'm, you know, researching nihilism and postmodernism, you know, it's almost like this super divergent period in the 21st century or 20th century and ongoing. And so what I mean by divergent is part of postmodernism says that all truth is relative, all values are relative. Nihilism says there is no grounding, therefore make your own meaning. But I don't know that that's true. Right. I think convergence is kind of the name of the game, which is, okay, yes, there is a lot of space. There is a lot of room for differences, but we can also converge on things. So like let's unpack that concept of convergence. So I just kind of said what it means to me. So what does convergence mean to you guys? Ellie?
Yeah, well, I have a point on like how does this relate to nihilism, and then you can get in convergence more on graph. But I actually think that like the process like of postmodernism, of like deconstructing everything and like the nihilism that came with it, I get it was like spiritually bleak for a lot of people, but it was so useful. It was so useful, and like we're very lucky to have like gone through that and now kind of like coming on the other way around, because like before what we had like morality and sort of like goodness, but like as static objects, right? That they were kind of like socially enforced via social norms. So kind of like, of course there is a good life, of course there is a good, like it's what God says, or it's kind of like what your local leader says, and like don't dare you to kind of like go away from that. So in a way, these kind of like process of like saying, oh, there's no ground truth, all of these are kind of like, you know, like relativistic objections, was what allowed us to kind of like differentiate like the good from social norms in a way, and kind of like see that like, oh, now I think we're going through kind of like this like new phase, like culturally, where we're kind of like coming around to this notion like, oh no, there might be such thing as the good, as meaning, as even like convergent wisdom. But this convergent wisdom is not something that like comes imposed from above, but rather like an emergent quality that like happens, or that like emerges once like everyone is like tuned in to like their own notions of the good. And that feels very different from what we had before. And I think like the bridge was really this like postmodern deconstruction of everything.
Right, absolutely. And in my work around what I call post-nihilism, of course, it's not fully defined yet, and metamodernism, which is kind of a new field, I realized that it's flipping it upside down, because in the past, like you said, it was from above, right? Some universal, allegedly universal truth from some authority, whether it was God or nature, the universe, or whatever. And that's a top-down view. And so then we kind of get rid of that, as you said, deconstructing things that allows us to differentiate, which I think is a good way of viewing it. But then emergence, which is a bottom-up view, which is kind of that's like the key reversal over the last century. And that emergent view feels really relatively new. And so my kind of mantra here is emergence and convergence are kind of the name of the game.
Yeah. Like same team.
Excellent. So on the topic of convergence, one of the experiments that you said that either you are doing or you want to do has to do with like local policy. So value bridging, like within municipalities, this is something that's really interesting to me as part of the future, because one of the things that I've talked about is economic agency. And so economic agency is like, if AI takes your job, then you have less agency. So how do we make sure that people have agency in the future? How can we use technology or other policies to do that? And so one way that you can have economic agency is having a voice in the way that things are shaped. Like if you live in a rural area, having voice over the agriculture, or being able to participate in co-ops, or if you live in a more urban area, being able to shape, schools and the other businesses and investments that are made. So that's one economic view that I have in terms of how convergence it might go. So with that kind of framing or that question, what is this experiment that you guys want to do? Like, how do you see it kind of playing out, and what would be the ideal hypothesis and some of the tests that you do for using moral graphs and AI around this policy and convergence and value bridging in a municipal environment?
Yeah, maybe I'll add something that's like not quite related to policy, but that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the alternative economy. When we're talking about like matchmaking around meaning, I missed the important aspect, which was, or the technical foundational aspect, which is like you actually have an LLM at the center, a sort of like wise AI that is community owned, like a co-op. So you could imagine like a rural area where the community, like even like the local church, like subscribes to some sort of like wise AI model, and like everyone participates, everyone owns it. And then they can like make decisions through it, but also like they can be meaning providers, like we call them like meaning suppliers. So the theory comes from like people find it like inherently meaningful to be of service to society and to the community. That's kind of like an inherent part of being human. And like right now, this is like very abstracted because we have this kind of like also like very big corporations and so on. But this is something that's like never going to go away, even in like a post-labor, post-AGI world. And what this makes it able is kind of like whatever people find meaningful to do for others. Some people like cooking, some people like hosting community gatherings, some people like, creating media. There's kind of like a network that would like match them and would be able to create like economic value through the LLM, because the LLM, you would opt in as a member. It could be like as simple as paying a membership, but also kind of like as also bringing assets into the LLM. And then the LLM would distribute, like not just matchmake meaning, but also like distribute resources for the people in the co-op based on kind of like how do you maximize the community's meaning. So that's kind of like one aspect. And then I guess it would tie to policy in sort of, the same like moral graph sort of way.
Right.
I think that's kind of like the voting aspect. Yeah.
Well, so it almost sounds like policy would then, rather than optimizing for economic efficiency, because that's kind of like the status quo today.
Yeah.
But a term that I recently learned in another interview is value co-creation, which is a way of looking at it as an infinite game rather than a finite game. And so rather than competing to win, everyone is competing to actually increase the system energy. And so like that everyone is like you look, if you were to try and put a number on it, you say like, okay, what is the total amount of meaning being generated in this community rather than the total amount of money being generated?
Yeah.
Is that kind of a way to look at kind of the way that this might be implemented?
And we think also that not only would lead to kind of like people living like much more fulfilling lives, but also to like much more like creativity, like both in like the artistic sense, but also like in the scientific sense, and kind of like a lot more innovation and kind of like social fabric and even kind of like communities being like much more resilient in the face of challenge, because like stronger communities tend to be like that. So it's not just, I just want to kind of like make the point. We think as meaning as the way of creating kind of like a good, resilient, innovative society, not just as a way to kind of like plug out of the world and chill and, la dolce vita of sorts.
So I have like something just kind of crystallized. You know, we transitioned from a labor-based economy to a knowledge-based economy to a services economy. So, and I had this idea that like we're going to move to an experience-based economy, but maybe a better way of wording that would be we're moving to a meaning-based economy.
Yes.
Well, that's
So
the
like,
word we use.
If we
yeah,
pull it
okay.
off.
Well, but I think that there's some alignment there because people are willing to spend money on meaning, right? And in many cases, people are willing to sacrifice their time, energy, money, whatever, in the pursuit of meaning. And so, you know, one of the personal things that I've discovered in researching this is, and this is not universal for everyone, but having a personal mission is one way of generating a lot of meaning. It's not the only way, but anyways, just an observation.
Totally. I just add one thing there. So like one aspect of looking at this meaning economy and just kind of like to crystallize what it could look like is to imagine that when you go shopping on Amazon, now everything is structured around your preferences. Like you can choose exactly which color you want in your bike. It should be blue and this shape, etc. But an alternative could be that you go to a place like Amazon and you want to shop for a particular kind of meaningful experience. But you want to shop for a particular kind of camaraderie that you had in the military, for instance. And you can't really do that because their whole economy is organized around preferences as the sort of unit in which we measure activity. And we imagine instead that you would be able to be very, very articulate and granular with what meaning is, such that you can even go and shop for it. And say, just, you know, in everyday conversations, say, I'm missing this type of meaning, you know, I'm missing this kind of camaraderie I had, or I'm missing this type of purpose I felt at this job, or I'm missing this kind of transcendent experience I had at a music rave, and be able to go shop for that. And currently that's very hard.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I'm thinking because like meetup.com is one of the few social media platforms that is geared towards actually creating those real in-person experiences. And yeah, so like, you know, I went to a really great concert that was like really intense, and it's like, cool, I want to have more of that, but it's rare. Or I'm trying to find like a men's group, and I'm sure there's a need for it, but there isn't a marketplace for it. And so kind of what you're saying is creating a new kind of marketplace that's not just about egotistical preferences. I don't mean egotistical in a pathological sense, but it's just like, what color do you want? But instead it's what meaning or value co-creation do you want to participate in, as a way of kind of reframing it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I'm saying that this is the kind of thing that like human creativity and labor will like never go out of fashion, you know, because we all like to contribute and like give meaningful experiences to people. Most people have had to like make the decision in their lives of like, okay, do I actually make money or do I like make meaning? And a lot of people didn't feel like it was possible to like live a life that was aligned with what they found most meaningful, also like in providing. And I think that's a great tragedy. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of like reshift the thing in that direction. And in that sense, UBI can be a complement, but it, you know, becomes superfluous even.
Right.
It's well executed.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, particularly here in America, you know, follow your dreams. I don't know if you have that in Europe as well, but that was kind of the ideal, right? Is that you engage with your passion, and that is how you find meaning, and it also becomes your career. Even the Japanese concept of ikigai, right? Like what you're passionate about, what adds value, so on and so forth. But so, all right, so let's look a little bit further into the future, because I don't know about you guys, but I kind of predict that AI is going to keep going in terms of capability. We don't really see a ceiling. So then if the economy as we know it, if jobs as we know it are going away and we're heading towards super intelligence, you mentioned that moral graphs are going to be relevant to that in terms of, because these entities, these agents, whatever shape they ultimately take, are going to be in a moral position or a values and meaning position that no human has ever been in and physically cannot be in, just because of the way that we process information. So you mentioned that you got some work that you want to do around super intelligence. So let's unpack that. Tell me what you want to do there. Yeah,
just to say that it's very early still. So this is far less clear than the rest of our work. But we do think it's possible to create something that we call artificial super wisdom. So some sort of system that's wiser than any one person alive. And by wiser, we mean something very concrete. We mean that it knows which values to apply for which context. That's what we mean by wise. It's a very practical definition. And we do think that it's possible that by using some sort of moral graph approach, we could create systems that can develop their new values and do the same sort of moral learning process that we do, as they're put into positions that humans have never been put into, and thereby develop new values in a human-compatible way.
So when you have like this future possibility, and plus I love the term artificial super wisdom. In some of my early alignment work, people said, well, why not wisdom instead of understanding? And I was like, okay, whatever, it's semantics. But I appreciate your definition of wisdom, which is it's a very practical thing, as you said. Like it's about the kind of the judicious application of making a decision, but a reasoned decision. So you mentioned like making it explainable as part of it. That's not the word that you used, but like basically where whatever decisions it makes, or the reason, the moral reasoning that it uses, it still is comprehensible to a human. Because that's one thing that people are concerned about, is that somehow in the future, because these machines are based on math, they will make decisions that we just can't comprehend, and then we might not agree with it. I personally don't see that as a risk, because if it's smarter than us, then it can explain things to us in our terms, like explain it like I'm 5. They can already do that. But to validate that risk and that fear, what do you see as, like, is this knowledge graph kind of the core of that, where it's like, hey, we're all looking at the same map in order to understand these values, or like, how do you kind of foresee that proceeding?
The reason why we foresee it in the first place is that we saw this in the process that we did for OpenAI, where there were certain edges that people didn't themselves articulate, but once they saw it, they were like, "Oh yeah, fuck yeah, that's great. That's a wise move." So they're able to see the wisdom in things that they themselves have not lived, like values articulated by people who might have lived through challenging experiences around abortion, and therefore have very refined values for how to deal with that. And then other people could kind of see that and give a thumbs up. So you could imagine something similar happen, where a superintelligence is put in positions of power where no human have been. They develop new values, and they're done in this human compatible format that we're sort of working with, where we can see the wisdom in its decisions.
Maybe
but again,
to a bit
very
more
early, so
to make it like a bit more tangible. Sometimes we use this, like, we haven't done this yet, but like this is like a possible research avenue that would be interested in creating like simulations, like just like The Sims, like the video games that like people used to play, and have the wise AI model playing them. But The Sims, instead of just kind of like living a normal life, is like The Sims, like more the trolley edition, right? The moral trolley edition. And so there, the model is putting kind of like very challenging, like moral situations that like they're kind of, the good answer comes from like what we elicited through the moral graph. And then eventually it learns more and more and more, and it becomes like super wise. So that's kind of.
So one thing that occurs to me, because, context and lived experiences and even being able to understand wisdom by observing another context, experience, or dilemma, and it just a big part of my own research and reading is the importance of narrative and story. And so it sounds like that's really kind of central to this, because it's almost impossible to articulate values outside of the context of a story, or like, here's the situation, like the context is the backstory, like how did you get where you're at, and then what is the dilemma that you face. And of course, this is the hallmark of all storytelling, which is your hero is confronted with a problem, whether it's an internal problem or external problem or whatever. So would you say that that's kind of like that is actually how you refine wisdom, is by going through more and more stories and kind of accumulating the wisdom through these parables?
Yeah, if you think of lived experience as a sort of story, then totally. And what we actually do in our graph is that we generate stories in between these. Like when we elicit the graph in our process for OpenAI, we generate stories in between values. And this is what people vote on. They vote on, do I think that this person in this story made a move into a wiser value? So totally.
Yeah, it's we didn't have this before. At the beginning, we had a screen where we just showed like 2 different values, and then like pick the one that's wiser. I was like, no, but like values are always contextual and embedded in story. And so that's why we ended creating the third screen that worked much better. So
So in this case, it's not like a directed acyclic graph. It's a directed graph in the fact that it is narratively linear. It's a story of moving from one like part of the narrative or context to the next, and then those discrete steps are where you make that value judgment of, yes, this choice was a superior moral choice, or value choice or meaning choice versus another. And so in that case, it is relativistic, but that's the linear like trajectory or story arc. Okay, that makes sense. So
yeah,
what?
it is pluralistic, but not relativistic of sorts. Yeah.
Pluralistic. Okay, gotcha. Important distinction.
Yeah.
So what kind of? I guess you said you're kind of very early in this work. So before we move on to the next topic, any final thoughts on the experiments that you want to do around superintelligence, or like in an ideal world, like you get a grant for $1 billion, what do you do next?
I think there's a lot of interesting work that can be done in this weak to strong generalization format that OpenAI is working with. Like, for instance, can we model a superintelligence with a powerful LLM and a weak LLM, or using a weak LLM for humans, and then see if we can kind of create new values using a strong one in a format such that the weak ones understand them. That's like one avenue of exploring this. Another avenue of exploring it is to kind of think of some sort of process of generating moral context such that new values could be developed within them. But right now I can't really give more detail than that because we're sort of just conceptualizing this.
Sure. No worries.
And we would hire some of the best researchers. We already have some of them around us, and be like, okay, now's the time.
So yeah, team building, right? That's you got to have the right people. So kind of one of the last things that I want to touch on, unless any other topics come up, but is the economic landscape. Like you said earlier, Ellie, markets are broken. And so kind of how do we create new incentive structures for this? Is that so? I guess there's a couple components. So how do we fix the markets? How do we fix incentive structures? And how do we solve those coordination problems? And I don't expect you to have all the answers, but like, what is like, just to put a cap on it, like, what is the direction here?
Yeah, no, the question, right? I mean, I think, super intelligence is complicated, super wisdom even more complicated. Fixing markets, that's like the real final boss of complicated. Yeah, so our idea, the experiments that we would like to do in this direction is similar thing that we were saying, to kind of like start with a pilot of local policy that's done with like our moral graph and likewise AI. Start with a pilot of our meaning economy. In a city, could be even like San Francisco, or even kind of like a community, like a group of friends, but kind of like with enough people that we could like actually like track the entire experiment. And we want to like measure whether we actually do a good job at like providing more meaning and economic opportunity for like meaningful creation and like meaningful collaboration. We think that if we do the experiment well, we believe that we would be able to create like an alternative metric for measuring wealth that's not GDP. That kind of would be like a meaning-based metric, and then potentially use that as a way to kind of like sell these to other institutions or like local governments or so on and so on. So kind of like that's one way that, we would like, it's still kind of like a bit far ahead, but like we would love to explore, and we have the intention of exploring at some point. Another option that's something that we hope to do this year is that we do these, because basically this question of like economic incentives is like too big. I don't think like no one on itself has the answer, but we're trying to, at least for myself, like creating event experiences where we go through kind of like, it's like a mini meaning economy. So like we do the policy thing, we do the economy thing in like one day, and then we invite kind of like relevant actors, players in like policy and like in economics and like in the AI labs, and to sort of like get a sense of like where they could take the direction. This is more kind of like a community building work. So what we're really trying to do is like, this mission is like huge. So we're trying to find the ways of like making the the vision very legible, very concrete, and easy to execute. But kind of decently easy to execute for people at the right spheres of power and influence.
Well, it sounds like measurement is one of the key things. So I've been conducting a bunch of systems thinking interviews, and whatever incentive structure you have, whatever market you have to have measurements. Because
Totally.
if you can't measure it, then you don't know if you're optimizing for it, and you don't know, if you don't have multiple measurements, you don't know what effect something has. So on the topic of how do you measure meaning in this case, if you want to optimize for it, or build a meaning economy, go ahead.
Yeah, this is the core of, I guess, where all this work comes from. This particular question: how do you measure meaning? Because a lot of society is built around revealed preference, like what you click on, what you buy. This kind of stuff is super easy to measure. You just hoover up the data, but measuring meaning is hard. It is getting easier though with language models, because they can understand us at a deep level and sort of pull out insights into ways we respond to things. And the most easy way to do this is to actually interview someone, and this is what we do in our process. We have them be interviewed by a chatbot. The chatbot tries to drill down into either a meaningful experience or how they approach a choice, and you get this values card. And we imagine that this process could be done in many different ways. Potentially, it could be done with static data that the user has outputted somewhere, whether that's in a journaling app or talking to another chatbot or something. But there is some sort of deeper interview process that needs to happen. You can't just look at what they click on, what they buy, etc.
Yeah, and maybe kind of like I'll say, so like the way that we measure meaning. So we have like first is like how do you define meaning concretely? That's like the way where we like create like the articulation of values, and then you can find all these metrics for like basically surveys. You just make like good surveys and you ask people whether these surveys is like actually helping them in these like particular like sources of meaning. So like measurement is a big part of the question, but the problem is, I'll give an example of something that happened a few years back. So a few years ago, this work was being applied inside Facebook, inside Meta, and there was like a lot of interest. That was kind of like when, I don't know if your listeners might remember, but when Zuckerberg was all about like, oh, I'm going to make Facebook like time well spent. These like old ages of humane tech and the internet. And there was a lot of interest in making kind of like newsfeed more meaningful. And there were some changes that like some of the designers inside Facebook, they tried to make happen that would make Facebook more meaningful. But then they also saw that turned down the ad revenue, right? And so if things were going well, they would just like turn up the meaning. But if they went bad, they would just like turn it down. And so making things meaningful or like measuring meaning is like not enough, even if everyone at Facebook agreed, because even like Zuckerberg agreed that he wanted to make more meaningful. There were kind of like other incentives, in this case, like economic. And then the thing with like Cambridge Analytica happened too. And then also Facebook went from trying to make Facebook more meaningful to like trying to make Facebook more secure, more like private. And that's why we're working with kind of like, yes, measuring is important, but also kind of like having a lot of people who are like not just aligned, but like deeply committed to like the vision at like different spheres of society is equal or even like more important than just metricizing. And yeah, maybe finally we'll say that we also hope that perhaps one of our other definitions of artificial super wisdom is that it allows us to find win-win situations in contexts where humans would not be able to do so. And I think the question of like misaligned incentives is a classic example of lose-lose dynamics. So maybe that will help in that.
Yeah, no, the conclusion sounds like one maybe a naive approach would be to monetize meaning rather than monetize attention. It's much easier to monetize attention because you get ad revenue and other things. Yeah. But monetizing meaning seems like they tried it and it didn't work. And so here we have an incentive misalignment. And so that's an unsolved problem. And I appreciate that in an ideal world, artificial super wisdom could help us solve that, figure it out, or find an alternative. Yeah. So thanks, guys. Any final thoughts with respect to moral graphs or anything else?
I just like to make one very small add-on with regards to measurability of values too. So
Yeah.
the way we define and think of values is through particular paths of attention that we do that feels meaningful to attend to. And this is important because it means that we can actually look at these and externally evaluate whether someone is attending to a value or not. So an example might be that I have a value around inspiring, let's say that igniting curiosity in my child, for instance. There might be particular things that you do there, like I'm looking at like moments where the eyes of the child light up or something like that. These are the things that we sort of get from the chat dialogue. And these are things that you can actually measure. Either, from a market perspective, you can measure like, is this happening? And when you train an ML model, you can evaluate, is these things surfaced in the conversation? And thereby evaluate, is the model actually attending to this value or not? So it's kind of a nerdy detail, but I think it's an important detail because it ties up a little bit this question around measurability and values.
No, that makes sense, because like if there are specific events or characteristics that you're looking for, AI can notice those now, but you can also, with model interpretability, you can know whether or not it's taking that into account correctly. So that's a very important point. So if folks want to get in touch with you,
I do want to say one thing, and then folks can get in touch. I would just encourage everyone who feels interested, inspired in the work that we're doing to try our GPT for like values articulation. Like that will help like really like land our points, because you will like actually experience ourselves what it means. So once do that, and then as I said, just in the end, like what we're trying to do is like huge and complicated, and we need like a lot of motivated and inspired people at like different spheres, like some of them in policy, some of them in like local governments, like some of them in economics. So if you happen to be in any of these spheres and like feel inspired by this work and would like to make it happen, please get in touch with us.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for jumping on short notice. It was a really wonderful conversation, and I hope that you guys continue getting all the resources and attention that you need, because I think you're doing really important work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's been great.
All right, excellent. Let me go ahead and stop the recording, and we can just do a quick recap. All right.